Daniel chapter 5. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the kings and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. The king called out for the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners to be brought, and said to these wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled. The queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. "O king, live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, I say, appointed him king of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. This man Daniel, whom the king called Belshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means." So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, "Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I have heard that you are able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be placed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Then Daniel answered the king, "You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. O king, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the peoples and nations and men of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death, and those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted, and those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and sets over them anyone he wishes. But you, his son, O Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought with you, and your nobles, your wives and your concubines, drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore, he has sent the hand that wrote the inscription. This is the inscription that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. This is what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62.
As we move to the end of looking at this first half of the book of Daniel, we now see some big changes happening in Babylon, which has been the land of exile and has been seen as this place of judgment for God's people. As we've been looking at so far in this series, God's people are living in this foreign land and they're under the rule of this powerful king. But starting at this chapter, a lot will now change as Babylon's whole order of things is going to be shook up, and the door's now going to be open for God's people to go home. So the first obvious big change that you would have noticed when we read this passage out is that King Nebuchadnezzar is now gone. As we have seen, he was both the king who destroyed Judah and the one who brought God's people into exile. He took them out of Jerusalem to Babylon, as well as the king which has been spoken of through all of the first 4 chapters of this book. But here we see that Babylon now has a new king, and Nebuchadnezzar, who was the ruler for several decades, is no longer. Which is why when we then look at what is the names and events being spoken of here, this is where things start to get rather interesting, because whilst it may not seem like it on a light reading, as you read it for the first time, you might not really notice what's going on here. This is really one of the most important chapters in the Bible, as it's almost a bit of a nexus of different theological themes and events in world history, all intersecting and all coming together, meaning that we can actually learn a great deal from it. There's a lot happening here which has implications for really everything else that we read going forward. Because the names and events of this chapter are actually known historical events. So we can start to bring together not only a lot of what the Bible teaches here about God's plan for the world and the way he brings those plans about, but we can also combine that with what is our historical records. And then when we do that, it gives a pretty clear picture of what is really happening here. That as this is one of the passages in the Bible that talks about what is significant events in history, and events which are so significant that we can actually easily get a lot of cross-references for it. Well, when we actually take all that and then put it with the Bible, it actually gives us a very important glimpse and a good understanding in how God operates in the world. So what I mean by this is, we know that King Nebuchadnezzar reigned as king from what is 605 BC to, we can be very precise here, the 7th of October, 562 BC. So just over 4 decades. And that as King Nebuchadnezzar II, as he was number 2, was such a significant person in history, we know when he became king and when he died, and we've got plenty of records of his reign, right? We know all this stuff. So because of this information, that means that chapter 2 of Daniel that we looked at a few weeks ago had to have been around what was 604 or maybe 603 BC. As it says in the first verse of chapter 2, that his dream that he had, that Daniel went on to then interpret, that big statue, well, that was in what was the second year of his reign, which means that chapters 3 and 4 had to have happened inside of what is this 4-decade window of Nebuchadnezzar's time as king. And whilst we can't know for sure when those events happened exactly, we can know that they're obviously between 604 and sometime before 562 when the king died. But then here in chapter 5, we see that there's a new ruler. So we obviously know that it's after 562 BC, as that is when Nebuchadnezzar died, and he's no longer here in chapter 5. But more importantly, we know at the end of this chapter that this new king, Belshazzar, well, he'll also be dead. So that now gives us a very accurate time of this passage and helps us to know so much of what was going on here as we start looking at what is the big promises that we've already looked at and seen in other parts of the Bible, those big promises being fulfilled and being fulfilled here in this chapter. Because we know that Belshazzar died at the fall of Babylon, that this event is when history records his death and that he therefore was the last ruler, the last person in control of Babylon. And as mentioned in our focus segment a few weeks back, we have this thing, it's called the Cyrus cylinder, a record of King Cyrus taking over Babylon and sending people back to their homelands. So it says on the cylinder that Cyrus is liberating the people of Babylon. He's the good king, and he's liberating them from what was their useless and corrupt ruler. That the people of Babylon, they needed to be freed, and it needed a new ruler put in place of the old king. So this chapter is happening at the time of what will be the Persian invasion of Babylon. The thing that the cylinder records is one of the biggest events in Middle Eastern history. Because after all of its conquering and its destroying and taking over of other nations, well, it's now time for Babylon to fall. And this is when it now gets conquered, which means that we are we can know this, at least 23 years since the last recorded event in Daniel. That whilst we don't know when chapter 4 happened, we know that we're now several decades later, as the events in this chapter is when we can start to get a very precise time on when this is going on, and we can start putting places and dates into that timeline and doing it fairly accurately. Because this chapter, it's recording the specific night of the fall of Babylon, so it must be happening in 539 BC, when history records it. In fact, we might even go one step further. As we know, Babylon fell to the Persians on the 12th of October, 539 BC. And that is how this chapter ends, and when Belshazzar is recorded in history to have died at that event, then we can most likely be pretty precise on just when this is all happening. And as it's about that night that Babylon fell, this is why we see it as both a warning of this coming event, it's saying it's about to happen, and also an explanation as to why it is happening, why Babylon had to fall. There's not just history playing its course in some sort of random fashion, but like the fall of Israel and the fall of Judah, it's an important part of God's plan for the world. Because if you think back to Habakkuk that we started this term looking at, we saw that this book was both a warning of what was coming, Judah's fall to Babylon, as well as a promise of deliverance from that. We see it said in that important chapter 2, verse 4 quote, "But the righteous person will live by faithfulness," the one that's often quoted in other parts of the New Testament. That verse, it starts off by saying, "See, the enemy is puffed up, his desires are not upright," which is speaking of the Babylonians and talking about the evil that they have in their heart and the lack of faith that they had, why they are not righteous. And then after this, it goes on to say in verse 5, "Indeed, wine betrays him. He is arrogant and never at rest." Something that we'll see clearly here in Daniel 5, as it's a celebration of the king when God's judgment comes down on them. They're celebrating on the very night that their entire civilization is about to fall. And it's at this moment that what was promised in Habakkuk 2, verse 16, this is when it now gets fulfilled. Because it said there about the Babylonians, now it is your turn. The cup from the Lord's right hand is coming around to you. So already before this exile, before Daniel even started, God's promise was that the Babylonians will not get away with this. They're going to be used by God to bring judgment on others, like Judah, but their time will come, and it happens here in Daniel chapter 5. That this is the moment God's promises become a reality, the moment where the dream of Nebuchadnezzar that we saw back in chapter 2, this is where it begins to happen, and a moment that we can actually place into real history, as we know the day that Belshazzar and Babylon fell to the Persians. So there's some background of what is going on and why, when we go through this today, we should be careful not just to see names and events and then, think little of them, for them not to really mean anything to us as we read it, but instead to see in these details what is really God's bigger plan at work, as it is a real world, historical, recorded event going on here, showing this plan of God's in action, which then shows us how God is at work in the world and why we have to trust in him and why we must humble ourselves before him. That there's this warning and a message here about how God deals with pride and why we must have the right attitude when we come before him. So there's just a few things to think about as we look at this passage today. That this is a turning point, a major event in history, and also God's plan at work, as so many of his promises, they're now all coming together and leading towards what will be the bigger things, what will be Jesus coming. And we'll see a lot more of how these promises are fulfilled as we work our way through this chapter. But before we start all that, how about I just pray for us as we look at this passage and we think about the importance of it for what is the gospel message, all right? What this should really mean for us, other than just the history of it, the facts. How about I just pray? Father, we pray as we look at this passage now, we ask as we go through a lot of the events happening here and the lessons they show us of the consequences of being unrepentant and arrogant in our attitude towards you. We pray that this will be a reminder to always trust in you and to humble ourselves before you so as to never close ourselves off from you and to come under your judgment. Amen. So we see the passage starts with Babylon seemingly in a good position. We know that it's not. We know that it's not based on the stuff that we just talked about before and how the Persians are now the real power in the region. But the king here, at least, seems to be putting on a show of still having complete control and power. He's still celebrating like he's the most powerful man on earth. Because it says here in verse 1, King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. So as we've looked at in this series, the Babylonians have been the superpower in the region as they've conquered what was really the known world. They've taken over the Middle East. That everyone from Assyria to even Egypt, they're either under the Babylonians' control or they're at least keeping their distance and not upsetting them, much as Judah did, until we see the king of Judah betrayed Nebuchadnezzar, which is what got Jerusalem destroyed and the city plundered of all its wealth and then brought into exile. Hence why we then read in verse 2, while Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. So at this point of the night, this king, Belshazzar, seems pretty pleased with the empire he's ruling over, and he's simply enjoying what is the spoils of war that they've collected over all these decades. Because you see here, he's using the very artifacts that the Babylonians took from what was the Lord's temple to drink their wine from, and he shows no apprehension in doing so. There's no fear in him in doing this. And worse still, it then says in verse 4, as they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So it's not just the arrogance of using what they stole from Jerusalem in their dinner celebration here that's on display, but it is also a clear return as a nation, as a kingdom here, returning to the pagan beliefs of their ancestors during this time. That they now again clearly worship all these other gods, even ones of just materials, the god of wood, the god of bronze and stuff like that. So the nation has again fallen a long way from just the end of chapter 4 that we were looking at last week, when the previous king said to the nation, and he sent a letter out to people everywhere, I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right and all his ways are just, and those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. And we see it's changed from that, because now this king, Belshazzar, well, he's forgotten that part of their history. And we see that he's actually enjoying desecrating the things of God's temple. It's almost like he's mocking God. That the way he drinks from the goblets which have been taken from the Lord's temple in Jerusalem, whilst at the same time taking pride in his power and then praising what are made up gods, well, it shows that unlike Nebuchadnezzar, he thinks nothing of God. And it shows that he has no fear of God at all. He just does whatever he wants to do. He thinks he still rules the world. So there's the context of what is going on here. They're having this celebration and showing that the nation is really at this point, it is back to living up to its reputation of being full of pride, being drunk on power, and basically just being the enemy of God and God's people. Which is why this party of his, it quickly changes in tone and shows a serious problem that Belshazzar will now have to face. Because whilst he's celebrating, whilst he's getting drunk on the wine and showing no concern for God, something disturbing happens in what is probably one of the most well-known events in the Bible. As said back in week 1 when we started this series, this book is full of events that have often shaped our own language today, and this is where we see it happen. Because we read in verse 5, it says, suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. So this is the famous, the writing is on the wall, a phrase used to suggest that there is clear signs that an event is coming, and it usually implies that the outcome of that event is going to be pretty bad. In fact, it even suggests that this bad outcome is actually unavoidable. So when people use it today, they're saying that it is obvious that the situation is unsalvageable and it's time to simply get ready for what is coming. That you can't ignore the clear signs anymore or even bother to deny them, as it should actually be clear to all something is about to happen. And this saying comes from this event right here, that these fingers are writing on the wall a message that shows basically that the future is set, it's written, and that it's not going to be good. And as we'll see later on, when we find out just what it was that was being written on this plaster wall, that is going to be exceptionally bad for the king and for the nation. But for now, we're only at the point of them just seeing these fingers writing on the wall, and they're having no idea what it means other than knowing that something crazy is going on here. Something important is happening. Because it certainly gets their attention as the celebration and the drinking and all the praising of the false gods, well, it just quickly comes to a halt. It just stops. Because it then says here in the rest of verses 5 and 6, the king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. And it's not really a surprise, because basically, if you can imagine, it's something like the thing from Adam's family, the little hand running around, that has just suddenly just showed up out of nowhere, and it's starting to write what is unreadable words for everyone to see. It's not just the king seeing this, everyone in the room is going, what is going on? And we see in this moment of fear that the king then does the same thing that Nebuchadnezzar used to do. Because it then says in verse 7 that he got the astrologers and the diviners, these so-called wise men of the kingdom that failed Nebuchadnezzar in all of his requests of them. And then the king says that if they can read these words, that this hand is written, that he'll give them gold and he'll give them and dress them in purple, which is the royal color, the restricted, important color of royalty. And even more than that, he'll give them power in the empire as he'll make that person, it says here, the third highest ruler in the kingdom. So he's given these wise men all the incentive to figure this mystery out, but predictably, when we look at what the hand had written, when they look at it, we read, it says here, they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled. So this is now the predicament. This is the problem here. In the midst of their prideful and what is really their blasphemous celebrations, something supernatural has happened. God has made contact with them, and it has terrified everyone as no one can figure it out. And unlike in past examples, when we see God interacting with the king of Babylon, where it was just a dream and a vision of what God would do one day, was given a glimpse of the future. Well, this isn't just in a dream inside the king's head. This is a visible event happening right in front of everyone in the room. They're all seeing this, and they have no understanding of what any of it means. It's got the whole king's court this time terrified, which is how we now move on to what will be the solution to this problem. Because as mentioned just a moment ago, we've seen again, the wise men of Babylon, they've got no idea. They can't explain this to the king. So this means this is where Daniel will re-enter the narrative. As we see here that he's obviously still alive, he's still in the kingdom, and he'll now do for this king what he used to do for Nebuchadnezzar before him. So we see in verse 10 that the queen tries to calm the situation down. She runs into the room and she tells the king not to be scared. And that is because in verse 11, she says, there is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. So we actually see that the queen is making the same mistake as what we saw Nebuchadnezzar do last week in chapter 4. That while she understands that Daniel has these special abilities and he can do these miraculous things, she also attributes these gifts to what is the spirit of the gods. That his ability to decipher these things, it doesn't come from God, but as she thinks it comes from the many pagan gods, just like the ones they're praising as they're drinking when the fingers showed up. But while she makes the same mistake as Nebuchadnezzar, she isn't less aware of Daniel's role in the past, unlike this king, Belshazzar, because she says to this king, in the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. And there are a few things in this verse that need to be clarified and explained. A few little interesting things that pop up that's worth just spending a moment talking about. For one, it says that Nebuchadnezzar was his father, which is not exactly right. He was actually Belshazzar's grandfather and grandfather on his mother's side. But simply calling a grandfather father was a common thing in the Bible. We don't see in the Old Testament anyone being called grandfather. They just don't use the word for that, as father is simply a term used for what is really any male ancestor. Hence why we see in the New Testament that the Pharisees, the Jews and all that, they talk about Father Abraham. And then going the other way, Jesus is called a son of David, despite being born literally 1,000 years later. So you can use words like father or son for anyone in the family line, even if there may have been what is many generations between them. So that's the first thing to point out. Another thing to note is that it could seem strange that the queen knows of Daniel, and yet the king doesn't. That he doesn't know his own father's history. And the reason for this is because this is unlikely to be his queen, as in his wife, Because as we saw in verse 2, the king was drinking with all his wives and concubines, and it was only in verse 10, after all the commotion, that this queen came into the room. So this queen would actually be his mother, who would be the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, hence why she knows about these things from the past. But those are really just trivial points, worth pointing out, but they're not that important. The main thing to note is that Daniel's past has built him a reputation, at least with the queen, that is now going to bring him into this. That the things that he used to do for Nebuchadnezzar, he's proven his worth, and that's going to make him valuable for what's going on here. Because at this point, he doesn't appear to have the king's ear like he did Nebuchadnezzar. In fact, as we will find out in verse 13, the king doesn't even know who Daniel is. So this is why we see in verse 12 that the queen gives the king Daniel's credentials. She talks about that past to say, listen to this guy, he can help you. Because she explains that Daniel was given a special name, Belteshazzar, which, as you'll notice, is not too far off and easy to mix up with the current king's name, Belshazzar. And that figuring this kind of stuff out, like what has just happened on the wall that has left everyone shocked, his ability to understand cryptic dreams and riddles and give an interpretation, this is something that he's already proven that he's capable of doing. He has the ability to do this. He can solve these kind of mysteries. Hence why we then see in verses 13 and 14 that Daniel is brought in and that the king understands that he is one of the exiles from Judah. Right? He's from that place where these goblets that he was drinking from, where he stole them from. And then he explains in verse 15 that no one can figure this out, what is on the wall, and that it's bewildered everybody. So he then in 16 makes the same offer to Daniel that he had made to all the other wise men. He says to him, if you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you'll be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. So the king is obviously desperate here. Despite the kind of arrogance and pride he was showing before and using the plunder from Jerusalem to celebrate and to drink his wine from, he now turns to someone from Judah and even offers to make him third in the kingdom. So in many ways, he's almost offering to give Daniel the same kind of authority that he once had under Nebuchadnezzar. He'll essentially be restoring Daniel to a position of high power that we can only assume was lost after Nebuchadnezzar died, because this king didn't even know who he was, where he came from originally. But with this offer being made, we actually get what is an interesting reply from Daniel. That whilst Daniel is willing to help, he shows no interest in the reward that has been offered. In fact, a bit like in chapter 1, where he didn't want to eat from the king's table because it would be putting himself in the king's debt. We now see something similar here, as he wants nothing from the king and he won't accept anything. But unlike under Nebuchadnezzar, where David was willing to serve him and work as a high official, here he seems to show no interest at all in having any position. And whilst that might seem a bit strange, as we know from the first several chapters, Daniel was able to use his high position in the kingdom to better make God known and use that position to help his people. Well, the reason for his change in attitude, it becomes pretty obvious when we see just what it is that was written on the wall, as we'll soon get to. Once he reveals this mystery, whatever the king has to offer is pretty much a waste of time. So after this offer was made and a request to figure out this mysterious writing, we see Daniel say to the king in verse 17, you may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. So as just mentioned, he has no interest in rewards, but he is happy to interpret the writing. He can do that and he will do that. But we see that before that happens, before he tells the king just what this all means, he then gives a quick history lesson and even a theological lesson to the king so he can understand what the message means when it's finally revealed. That he's going to give the context first, then give the translation so it all makes sense. So he says in 18 that it was the Most High God who made Nebuchadnezzar great and gave him his power. So we see the use of this name, Most High God, being used again to make it clear that he's not like those other pagan gods of wood and iron and nonsense like that, but he is the supreme God and the one and only God, the real God. Remembering that the only reason he's in the room talking to the king is because the queen had once again assumed that Daniel was given all this knowledge that he had shown in the past from these many pagan gods inside of him. So Daniel's making it clear here. He wants to make it very clear so there's no misunderstanding both where his power comes from and even when the kings of Babylon, even where they get their authority from. He's making it clear it's all from the Most High God. That's the big point here. Don't attribute that power to anyone else, and for the king to know where his authority ultimately comes from as well. Which is why he goes on to say that because the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar this power, well, this is why eventually everyone on earth feared the king, and that he could really do whatever he wanted, and there was no one on earth to stand in his way. That the king's power in the world was essentially unlimited, and it was even unregulated. He didn't fear anyone. But then we get to the key part of all that, because it then says in verse 20, but when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was disposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. And then goes on to say that he was driven away and that he lived with the animals. And as we saw last week, even acted and even thought like a simple animal. And again, like in chapter 4, we then see the reasons for this, where it says at the end of verse 21 that this happened until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and sets over them anyone he wishes. So before Daniel goes giving the meaning of the words on the wall, he's framing the situation in both its history and what is its spiritual reality. That Babylon and its kings, they only became powerful because the Most High God had made them so. And then when the king got too big for himself and started to believe in his own hype and ignored where that power came from, then that same Most High God just simply took it all away. Like how we read at the start of Samuel in 1 Samuel 2:7, where it says, the Lord sends poverty and wealth, he humbles and exalts, showing that all that a person has in this world, or all that they don't have in this world, is the Lord's doing, that he's in control of it all. Or perhaps more famously, at the very start of the book of Job, where he says in verse 1, chapter 1, verse 21, the Lord gave and the Lord has taken away, which is where we today get the very popular saying, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away, which is probably as well known as the saying from this chapter, the writing is on the wall. And that Job quote, it simply means that all anyone has, it comes from the Most High God. And what God has given, he can therefore obviously take away. And that is the point that Daniel is making here. All that King Nebuchadnezzar was, and all that Babylon is, it all came from the one and only God. And when Nebuchadnezzar forgot this fact, and he started to take pride in himself, God humbled him. He took it all away. And whilst Nebuchadnezzar learnt from that lesson, and he was therefore restored to power, and now praising God and worshiping him, as we've seen at the start of this chapter, Belshazzar now has no such humility as he celebrates his power using plunder taken from the Most High God's temple to drink out of. That is nothing like Nebuchadnezzar. His attitude, his pride, it's totally different, and he hasn't learned anything from the past. Which is why, as we read on, we now have Daniel make this clear to the king. That we now move to what will be not only the translation and the interpretation of the words on the wall, but we're actually going to get a judgment being given to the king as well. That what was just said is now going to be explained to him. That the words will talk about what is about to happen. And Daniel is going to tell the king why this is so, as the king has actually brought this event, he's brought it upon himself, and God's judgment on him and his kingdom, because of his behavior, that judgment has already been set. It's already been passed. So we read in verse 22, this is what Daniel now says. But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. So Daniel is already saying to the king that because of the events back in chapter 4, this is why this king, this is why he is without excuse. That when his grandfather got full of himself, well, he did it out of ignorance. But this king, well, he had the opportunity to learn from the former one's mistake, as he already has had this knowledge passed on to him. He knows of the time that Nebuchadnezzar ran off and lived with the animals. He knows of what Nebuchadnezzar would have said about how he now worships God. And yet, despite all that history, which is not that long ago, he willfully chooses to just ignore it. So the Most High God has made himself known in Babylon already, and already brought one king down, already humbled him, and yet this one now acts with total arrogance. Which is why he then says, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines drank wine for them. And then goes on to talk about how as they drank from these stolen goblets of the Lord, they praise what is man-made gods of wood and iron, and that he did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. So he's making it very clear now that because of all this stuff that's happened in the past, you cannot plead ignorance because you knew the truth, yet you acted like this anyway. That in his pride, he has directly gone against God, despite the fact that God is the one who gave him his power in the first place. That, like as some of us have seen in our Connect group this week, or we'll later on see today for today's Bible study group, that this is here the suppressing of the truth that happens when people fall into sin and harden their hearts and reject God. And as the king has done this is why we then see just what these words on the wall are all about. Because Daniel now says, therefore, he sent the hand that wrote the inscription, which, as we can see, are the words Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin, followed by what it all means. So we see that Mene means God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So the words are a judgment, that the king's days are literally numbered, and those days have now run out. And specifically, that the Persians will come to conquer Babylon and take all of its land and now place it all under their rule. Which is what we see happening right here at the end of the chapter. Because in verse 29, we see the king gives Daniel the purple and gold that he offered for the interpretation, perhaps maybe hoping his good gesture will change things. But as we see in verse 30, that those words on the wall happen right there and then. Because it says here, that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. And Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Which has really taken us back to that vision of chapter 2. Because if you remember back there with the dream, the king saw a statue made of all these different materials that were broken down by a rock that became a mountain and filled the world. And Daniel described the dream by saying in verse 32, The head of the statue was made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver. And then at the end of verse 38, the interpretation to the king was, you are the head of gold. And then in verse 39, after you, another kingdom will come. And this is that vision now happening. Babylon, the gold empire, is being replaced by the silver one after it, which is the Persians. And as we saw at the end of chapter 1, it said, and Daniel remained there, as in he remained in Babylon, until the first year of King Cyrus, which, as we know, is the king of Persia and the one who wrote the words of that Cyrus cylinder that we looked at a few weeks ago. So this is the point where Babylon falls. This is where Babylon now pays for its pride and arrogance. Like the nations who fell to the Babylonians as they were judged by God for their pride and sin. Now it is their turn to be brought down by the next empire that God has risen up. In fact, when we look at a passage like Isaiah chapter 45, we see this very moment being promised, and being promised what is 2 centuries before it happened. We've seen verse 1 of Isaiah 45, but it says, this is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus, so it even names him long before he was born, whose right hand I take hold of to subdue nations before him and to strip kings of their armor, to open doors before him so that the gates will not be shut. So we see it says here that God is going to rise Cyrus and the Persians up so as to bring down other nations like the Babylonians. And then it goes on to say in verse 4 that this is all going to happen in the future. For the sake of Jacob my servant, of Israel my chosen, I summon you by name and bestow on you the title of honor, though you do not acknowledge me. So it's saying this Persian king will conquer Babylon, even though that king doesn't worship God. But this will happen so that God's people can leave exile and go home. That it's for their sake that all this is going to happen. And then in verse 13, it makes it very clear that this is indeed the plan. This is what it's describing, this event right here, because it says, I will rise up Cyrus in my righteousness. I will make all his way straight. He will rebuild my city and set my exiles free. In fact, at the end of the chapter just before this, what is Isaiah 44, in verse 28, it's even more specific on this point. As it says back there, he will say of Jerusalem, let it be rebuilt, and of the temple, let its foundations be laid, which is what we then see decreed in Ezra chapter 1, the text that parallels the writing on the Cyrus cylinder about sending people back to their land to worship their God. And it's what we saw happening when we went through Haggai, as they did in fact go home and they did rebuild the temple. But the big point is that it's here in Daniel 5 where all this is coming together, and now it's all being put in motion. The writing that was on the wall, the reason why we even have that saying today and we use it to speak of impending doom and no way to change what is coming, it's because that is what these words were saying to Babylon and King Belshazzar. It was saying to him that the time of the Babylonians, it's coming to an end, and it's coming to the end because of their pride and sin. And it's letting them know that the Persians were coming to destroy them, just as the Babylonians were used by God to destroy others. That this is God's plan to free his exiles, and it had already been planned before Babylon even rose to this power and before anyone had even heard, or before it was even King Cyrus had even been born. So to finish this all up today, we've looked at what is really a lot of history, right? A lot of events out of our history books, as well as a lot of biblical theology, and how several promises and prophecies, some that we haven't looked at, some that we just looked at today, how they all come together and come together at this point. It's all happening here now in Daniel 5. And that raises the question of, well, what is the point of it all? You know, what is the lesson that we can take from this? More than just understand the history of it. What can we learn? And there is, of course, I'd say a lot of basic messages that we can simply get from this chapter. For one, we could think about the consequences of pride and arrogance, as King Belshazzar's extravagant feast and his disregard for the artifacts that were taken from the temple. It all showed what is his rebellious attitude and what is ultimately his disrespect for God. So because of that, a simple message, don't be like that, right? Don't be like him. Don't reject God and don't pridefully taunt him by acting with the foolishness of the king here. Likewise, we could think about God's sovereignty and judgment. As this all happened, we see it being spelled out here. This all happened because of that pride and arrogance of the king. So we see that this is a judgment on Belshazzar and Babylon itself for their sinful actions. So again, the lesson would be, know that God does humble the proud, as we saw with Nebuchadnezzar, and don't think that he's not there watching or that he'll let sin go unpunished. No one can get away from God. He's there, he's watching, his judgment will happen. And of course, coupled with that message, that lesson there, we could also see how this shows God's larger plan for the world and the trust that we should have in him and for trust in his promises actually being fulfilled. That we always have to remember that when things look bad, which it would have for those in exile, those living in Babylon, and for them and Daniel looking even worse under this new king that doesn't even recognize them. Well, despite how things might appear, the point that we see here is God had a plan the entire time. So even if we today, even if we don't fully understand why things happen, always know that everything is leading to the end of God's plan. Everything is leading towards Christ's return and God's eternal kingdom, where things like this will be no more. There's a message there. God's plan, it's going to happen. So trust in it. Don't lose faith. Which is probably why the most important thing that we can get from this is probably the lesson given about having the right attitude. The kind of thing that enables us to trust in that plan and to humble ourselves and to honor God, which we see so clearly here when we contrast what happens in this chapter with what we just looked at last week in chapter 4. Because in both of these chapters, we have something very similar happening. In both of these, we have two kings, both powerful, both full of pride, and neither of them are a part of God's people. They're not Jews. And yet one of them gives all praise in God after being humbled, and the other shows no sign of repentance at all. No sign that anything, even the hand that was writing, really had the impact other than fear to actually change that king's heart. Which is why when we then compare the conclusions of each chapter, what they led to, we see the different outcomes that these different attitudes of these two men had. What their consequences were for each. Because for Nebuchadnezzar, we read him say this, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right and all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble." Whilst for Belshazzar, we see Daniel say, "But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways," which then finishes with, "That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain." And this is despite the fact that he had no excuse for not honoring God and for not humbling himself. Because as Daniel had already said to him a little earlier, "But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this." So this is really about how we come before God. This is a difference between foolishness and immaturity that leads to mistakes, such as what we see with Nebuchadnezzar. He was foolish compared to the arrogance and a closed heart that will not change its ways, as shown by King Belshazzar. Which means for us now looking at this, the lesson given is to pay attention to what God says, to read God's word, and to make sure to learn the lessons that it shows us. It's for us to know the gospel, know what Jesus has done, and trust in him and wait for his return, the end of that grand plan. Because you think of how many people right now, people you might know, people just in our society, people in Australia, around the world, people who have heard of Jesus and care nothing for what he has done. You think of those people and then think of how many of those people could you take these words to Belshazzar, but you have not humbled yourself, though you knew of this, and then apply it to people today who have been told the gospel and yet they've ignored it anyway. We see it time and time. People know, but they don't want to listen. And it means that since it has been revealed, and we all have the chance to hear it, then we need to respond. And if we do that, we want to respond before we have to get to the point of needing the writing on the wall, of needing it spelt out in such an obvious way. And that is because God has already made his ways known already. He's right there in the Bible for us to read, and it's all through history as well. That's the big point that we're looking at today. The world shows it, even in its own history records. Because when we look at the rise and fall of nations, and when we look at the descent and then the restoration of equality in society as it goes in these waves, sometimes over centuries, we actually can see God's hand in all of it. If we're looking, we'll see it. It's really clear. And so much of the craziness that we see happening in our society today, we actually know it's not new, as the Bible already told us that this would happen, that this is what sin does. So it's already been shown to us if we're only willing to look. So as it's already there for us, it's already written there for us. We don't need an event like this to spell it out, to literally, in this case, write it on the wall. Instead, we just need to pay attention and listen to God's revelation to us. And then once we've paid attention, once we've listened, then simply trust in him. And we want to do that so we never stand before him one day where he then says something like, you have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. That's the big point here. Belshazzar knew it all, and he ignored it anyway. And people today know the gospel, and they ignore it anyway. So we don't want to be at that point where we're ignoring all that God's revealed. The big thing in here is to say, humble yourself. Make sure that you've already got the message. Don't wait until that writing's on the wall when it's too late. That's the point here. It was too late. The writing was on the wall when next minute he was dead. The point is, before that happens, look at everything that has already happened. Look at the way God's plan has been revealed in the world. Humble yourself, trust in him, and make sure that you follow all his ways.